Howdy, folks. Hopefully, sound is working on this thing because we're trying something a little bit different to where I don't have that crappy headset that gives really terrible quality to you all. So, hopefully, if you can hear this, let me know and drop something in the chat or the like because we're going to do our monthly Q&A today, March 2023, 2024. Oh my gosh, 2024. And we're going to see what comes out. Hi to anybody who's new to the channel here. My name's Timothy, though some people do call me Tim. I'm a professional dungeon master running over 300 games of D&D a year. And today I have a few prepared questions that people have asked that we're going to answer. And then, of course, we'll open things up in the chat for anybody who wants to submit any further questions throughout. And we'll just see how much stuff we can talk about D&D because D&D is awesome. Appreciate you all for being here and looking forward to seeing what we can discover together as we muse about my favorite hobby. All right. To get things off and running, let's go ahead and talk some pre-prepared questions. We have 4 of them already ready to roll, and if you drop any further ones in the chat, we'll get to those. But first up, pre-submitted through our mailing list, was from Matthew. He asked, how do you prep mysteries? Is there anything that you think sets mysteries apart from other adventure types? It's a great question. Mysteries are actually one of my favorite kinds of D&D adventure to run or to create, mostly because the gameplay is just so interesting to me. I think it's fun how people get stuck looking for these little questions, trying to figure it out. They're only getting pieces of the puzzle, and eventually it all comes together. There's that big aha moment at the end, and everybody has that like feeling of satisfaction when you complete the story of being able to look back and see all the things that they missed the first time around. And I think creating that feeling is honestly the focus point of what sets a mystery adventure apart from, say, a dungeon crawl or a heist or a monster hunt. In order to prep a mystery adventure, I really like to lean on Mike Shea's list of clues as one way to make those kinds of adventures the most satisfying. By his method, he suggests pretty much every time you're preparing for even a session of D&D, having a list of 10 secrets and clues and 10 complications that you can just fit and match into your game. So if you take these secrets and clues and you break down the actual incident that you've got for your mystery and then tear it apart into tiny little snippets of information, then you can use those little snippets of information to put them into place. Some of them are going to be obviously like locationally bound, and it's going to be obvious to you beforehand how your party is probably going to come upon that information. But other pieces are going to be way more random. You might not have any idea of how that information is going to get into the party's hands, but it's a piece of information, a piece of the whole that leads there. And so by having this master list of clues, when people surprise you with the methods that they use to find the information, those secrets can just be popped in at places that fit the narrative, places where it actually makes sense for them to have discovered that information, but you didn't think of it in the first place. Because if you try to craft it from beginning to end and you put specific hints in very specific places, particularly like happens in a lot of published adventures where some of those hints get gated behind a successful check, it's amazing how often you can completely torpedo your mystery by placing them very specifically and not having any other alternatives for people to be able to pull them into knowledge and into existence to make it make sense. So I like to sort of take my hands off a little bit about where all the information comes from, decide a bunch of different pieces of information that they might want, that might be helpful, and then I piecemeal them out when they conduct their investigation. I think a big part of mysteries, if you're trying to prep a good one, is also to find a way to create some kind of time binding on it so that you can continue to ratchet up tension as you come towards it. Because that's one thing that mysteries can tend to lack a little bit, is a proper tension towards getting the result. You can end up just stymieing in this analysis paralysis stage really badly if you don't have something that pushes people to keep moving towards the next stage. The Candlekeep Mysteries that came out last year or the year before, I don't even remember exactly, has a load of great material in it that can be a great blueprint for mysteries. And mysteries also tend towards really being great for giving little handouts or the like, if you're into those kinds of arts and crafts and can do creation. So when I'm doing an in-person mystery, I will lean towards those a little bit more, even though I'm not particularly crafty. I hope that helps, Matthew. I think that there's absolutely volumes of work that we could talk about mystery adventures and how to make them better. I don't have a resource off the top of my head as to one that would be suitable to go and check that's already in existence, except going and taking a look at the Candlekeep Mysteries anthology and sort of start pulling apart those for ideas. They're not as perfect mysteries as, say, the Golden Key is perfect heists, but they really do nail a lot of the important aspects of it by creating something that invests the characters, some kind of time binding that makes things last and makes people need to get through it, and then a sprinkling of clues scattered around. Just be sure that you don't bind them down to any one thing too much. Got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm just going to copy real fast so that I have them for us later. Thank you, Ryan and Matthew, for those. And welcome to those of you who are saying hi there. Hi, Nikaris, Ryan, Spencer. Great to have you here with us. And I appreciate you watching today and having questions. That's super great. All right. Let's see. Aris Knight submitted a question on our community tab asking if I had any advice on how to guess game time during session prep. He was talking about having done some preparation beforehand and then not being sure if he'd done too much for a 3 to 4 hour session. And this is a really real problem. And it's a tough one, too, because it's very individual to both you as a DM and your table and the individual players that are there. Some of my groups, you could literally just give them a role-playing prompt and sit back for a 4-hour session, and they would still be goobing about it and chattering one back and forth when you got done. Other ones, if you don't pull them into each individual scene, you won't be able to get them to make a decision and choose something and do something at all. And so it can really vary wildly as to how much preparation you need in order to deliver at your table. As a general rule of thumb, there's nothing wrong with over preparing if you have material that you could potentially salvage for use later. I don't like to prepare so much that people are left never being able to finish the entirety of the story, or to where my work gets thrown away after the fact and never gets touched on. But preparation is a very individual thing that each person does differently. I would say that in a typical adventuring party, if you're talking a 4-hour session, then including all of the chitter chatter that goes on at the beginnings and the ends of your game, you can probably get away with 4 solid scenes with reliability at most tables. At lower levels, you can get through more scenes. At higher levels, less scenes, because as soon as you throw a combat scene in there, the higher the level of the game, the more time it tends to take to resolve, unless you're throwing out really simple encounters. So what I like, one resource that gives you a great means of making a good plan for what will fill out your average session is to use John Ford's 5-room dungeon approach, where it gives you sort of a prompt to help you build out the different ideas of what kind of encounters you might need to have prepared, what kind of what kind of options you might need. And by having those on hand, you can be pretty assured that one of them might take long, another one might be short, and you can work it out. If you're trying to do something like a one shot where you have a really strong budget of time that you have to finish the entire adventure in that period of time, then for preparation work, make sure that you're preparing your beginning very, very strong and you're preparing your ending very strong. And then make sure that each of the middle portions that you prepare is able to go towards that ending and impact it in some fashion, but is not necessarily utterly vital. If you're running for instance, there's a thing out there on the internet. People talk about running Curse of Strahd in one session, a one shot Curse of Strahd night, where you start out in the castle and you go wandering through it, trying to find things that are going to power you up and make you stronger. And at the certain appointed hour, Strahd shows up and you fight no matter what. That's an example of having a strong beginning and knowing that initial scene, having material around that people can engage with that is more than they could possibly ever chew off, and then the ending arrives to them in time to complete it. You're going to have to be, to some degree, a judge as to how long it's going to take your particular party to finish a combat like that final scene. But if you've got a strong preparation for the beginning and the ending, then you can flex the middle a lot more depending upon how much prepared material you have. So if you feel like you have too much, then just make sure that you've broken it up into chunks that you can remove something from in order to establish the amount of time that you need, or even just in the middle of one of these investigations or one of these portions of your dungeon, you drag the ending to the players instead of making them go to it, so that you can wrap up your story in that very tight, allotted amount of time. I personally run a lot of campaigns versus one shots. And so I don't find it to be as much of a problem when you're preparing too much for your session, because I'll just run another session next week and we'll continue on from there. And I can build on what I've already prepared to make it even longer, even better, even more in depth. So extra preparation is actually a good thing in my particular situation. But if you're running a one shot, that's pretty much the kind of advice that I would give to take care of that. Um, let's see. Going to run on to our next question prepared before we go back to the comments there. Thank you for everybody. Troy asked, do you think it's more difficult to craft social encounters for high level players? I would say yes and no to some degree. Crafting a social encounter at higher levels, I've discovered that the higher level people go, the more they seem to just be willing to not worry about the difficulty of things, because they know that they've got all these great tools. And so they don't necessarily drive as deep into some of the social encounters that get put out there, which is a weird conundrum that's come up at a couple of times at just a couple of my tables. So that's one thing that you might want to be concerned about. But otherwise, a social encounter is pretty much a social encounter is a social encounter. And as long as there are appropriate consequences to your social encounters, then at high or low tiers, the gameplay pretty much is the same, and it's not as concerning. The hardest parts of balancing high levels in social encounters is the use of skill checks inside of them, because the bounded accuracy system and the way that monsters and NPCs are largely designed in the books for everybody keeps the numbers for your DM side of things fairly low in order to allow anybody to interact with them. But in practicality, most players seem to specialize into those things that they're good at, which is a natural inclination to do. And so you end up with really, really good insight checks on one guy that's doing all of the insight checking in order to determine whether or not they're being misled, or whether or not there's some underlying concern. So the way to keep high level encounters the same as low level encounters is to make sure that when you are engaging in those kinds of skills, that they are not the be all and end all of your encounter. For instance, insight is not a lie detector. Insight is not a are they lying question. Insight is a what kind of body language are they using? Do they look nervous? How are they reacting right here? And it might give some insight that your player can then leverage into thinking that somebody is lying, but it doesn't tell them the answer to the question. Particularly if you are, like me, keeping those kinds of checks where you couldn't know if you succeeded or failed behind the screen, then it enables you to make sure that at low or high levels, people who interact with other characters are and NPCs are always having to rely upon their own thoughts of what their character is thinking, and they can't just uh, go through it by yes, this is a lie, no, that's not a lie, yes, he's telling the truth, whatever. You can't, if you don't give that as a response, then the encounter stays pretty easy to manage, and people can just be more confident in the information that they're gathering because they have a larger bonus. Somebody with a plus 15 to their insight should feel pretty confident that they are getting the true feelings or the true hints from the NPC that they're talking to, even if they don't see what rolls on the dice. And so it makes those occasions where the dice work out to subvert things all the more telling and interesting. But in the rest of the time, it still relies upon players to use their own brains to determine what that information means instead of just carte blanching it with a quick dice check. Uh, I'm not sure if that necessarily 100% answers your question there, Troy. So if you have a follow up question, then feel free to let me know, and I'll do my best to address it closer, either one on one or on a video or the like. But I hope that gives some idea of how to keep high level social encounters feeling the same as low level ones throughout the course of an adventuring career. Alric pre-submitted a question about what classes I would allow to make magical items that level up with the character and what restrictions I would use as to who could create what. I have a video just coming out, as well as a video that we've seen before, about how I roughly go about including magical item creation into campaigns. So definitely, if you haven't looked at those yet, those would be worth checking out, Alric. But when it comes to something like the vestiges of power or the new magical items from Fizzbands that have levels of power that grow, and then applying that to a character basis. Like I think I was recently shared something from Ginny D that is a video that details how to build a growing magic item, one that levels up with you. And it's certainly something that's been used in video games and in older editions of Dungeons and Dragons relatively frequently. I don't have any particular specific system already built for how this plays out, though I have a couple of these items currently in play and or coming up in play in my most recently beginning campaign. I would allow basically anybody whose player's fantasy is about creating magic items to participate in the creating of magic items. If somebody wants to be involved in that sort of play, finding a reason to let them be involved in that kind of play is important to me personally. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't characters to whom it doesn't make a ton of sense. If you have a guy with absolutely no tool proficiencies and no magical aptitude, then you're going to be having to stretch a little bit for them to be creating some ancient magical sword. But even that person with that interest in it could be the one hunting down research notes on how to create it, gathering the components, and gathering a team together to build it. And so they would be able to take a part in it no matter what. I wouldn't necessarily build items. I wouldn't advise building items that grow with characters for every single campaign or for every single class, but neither would I create artificial restrictions around it for people that are interested in it. If you're looking for who should just be allowed to just by the lore, then the lore informs you. Artificers, obviously. Wizards, most likely in most cases, but particularly transmutation wizards would be very fitting. and forge clerics and other clerics of creation gods, or even creation bards, would make obvious sense as being the kinds of characters that could be involved in that. But your players will generally self-select into that. If they know that you're open to the idea of creating magic items and they're interested in it, then their character will typically represent some subset that makes sense to be participating in that kind of thing. So I wouldn't worry too much about who's in it or what kind of restrictions you need to put in it, outside of just thinking through the logical portions of it, that you're not going to be smithing something if you're not trained in smith tools, and you're not going to be creating something that involves magical casting yourself without any assistance if you can't cast any of the prerequisite spell. So don't worry about that too much, but instead you would need to really focus on the system that you have for the item in question and how you can balance that to be an appropriate item at your table, whatever that means for you, because every table's got a different degree of willingness to break the bounded accuracy system. And so it's important that you're just building it for your table. And that really would take an entire video all on its own, Alric. So I apologize, I'm not going to jump down that rabbit hole any further. Thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it. All right. Couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to grab and drop onto my little file here, and then a couple more questions that we've already got going, and we will jump. All right. And here we go. All right. So from the chat, Matt Chandler, Matthew, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Asked, what is your favorite class/build, either multi-class or solo? Okay. I tend towards single class characters for me personally, just because I really like them. I really like devoting to something specific and just getting really, really good at it. But that's just been my 5th edition experience. In 3rd edition, I loved multi-classing the crazy out of things in order to come up with really specific wild tangents and builds out there. I think my current favorite build, if you really want to go that route, is one of my players is using on my Thursday night game. He is playing a drow rogue soul knife with an investigator side and focused in on proper caution and checking for traps and things like that. And with the drow high magic feat has detect magic at will, which I just think is fun. And so the soul knife being so good at their different options, anything that they're proficient in, they're really, really awesome at higher levels. They get loads of cool, interesting tricks, teleportation, invisibility. They do psychic damage with daggers that can't be traced and leave bodies with no visible marks on them. They're just cool and fun. And so it's a character type that I really enjoy, but I probably wouldn't choose to play myself just because I've seen it in play and I try to do something different. When I create a character, I almost always wait until everybody else has created a character and then try to figure out something that nobody else focused on and focus on that. It does mean that I end up playing the healer more often than most people, but that's just my personal preference, is to be useful. I really want to be unique and useful at the table. And so it's important to me because of that, that my players get the opportunity to be unique and useful and that everybody has their moments to shine. So I don't have a super strong preference towards a particular class, though I have always been very, very fond of wizards ever since my 2nd edition days, when I started out with Neblin Carius Vacation, the gnomish illusionist. All right. Thank you for the question there, Matthew. We had a question from Ryan asking if I allow homebrew and unearthed arcana. The answer to that being yes and no. So I do allow homebrew at my table, but only if it's brew that I have been a part of brewing, as a general rule. So if players want homebrew at my tables, either they brew it on the spot with me and we work through it together, or I brew it and they use it because I gave it to them. I will sometimes experiment with homebrew monsters that have come to me from various sources or by building them my own. but I tend to be cautious about that, and I usually make a few little minor adjustments myself just to make it fit with my vision and make sure that the numbers are balanced because homebrew can get really outrageous out there. Unearthed Arcana, I've recently done a reasonable number of play tests with the one D&D rules where we brought in Unearthed Arcana of that sort, but otherwise I try to avoid Unearthed Arcana in play simply because if it's not something that absolutely captures the imagination of the player and is vital to the concept that they're trying to bring out, there's almost always another way that isn't as broken in order to bring it out into play. One of my superpowers that my family has identified for me is the ability to create any concept that somebody comes up with uh, in play without having to go to new special rules that are hidden away somewhere. Uh, any concept that has been brought out, you can already create. You just have to fiddle with the numbers, fiddle with the ideas, be willing to accept not being the absolute best at absolutely everything, and instead just focus in on being awesome in that one specific thing. And so I don't feel a strong need for a lot of homebrew or unearthed arcana in the game for me personally, but I bend depending on my tables because I'm a professional dungeon master, which means not only do I run a lot more games than anybody else, but the other side to being a professional DM is that my players are paying me for an experience that they want to have control over, and so it sort of behooves me to switch my personal preferences to match those of my players at the table. And I try very hard to do that for each individual table. So if I have an entire group of people who just want to test the boundaries and go wild with homebrew, then that table is going to get a lot of homebrew. But most of my tables do not. Let's see. My absolute favorite Foundry modules and why I like them from Brady. Welcome, Brady. Thanks for joining us. Uh, Okay, that one's an interesting one. Foundry obviously is a virtual tabletop that not everybody is using, but it is growing very, very popular, and I use it pretty much exclusively for the games that I run. Even my home game, I put the screen up on a great big television for everybody to be able to see the map, and we use Foundry for a lot of different aspects of the campaign in the live games that I run nowadays. I would say that my favorite module is currently causing me trouble, actually, which was it used to be called Better Rolls for 5e, and now it's Ready Set Roll for 5e. And it basically just makes things more one click manageable in order to be able to smooth and speed play along without having to go through a 5-click sequence for every time you want to attack, or a 20, 30 some odd clicks in order to get an Echo Knight fighter through their action. So it's a big favorite for time saving for me. I really like Crash's hidden rolls. I think something like that. Crash's forced hidden roll, something like that, which allows me to set certain skill checks that automatically are hidden from the players so that they're allowed to push the button and roll their own dice, but on insight checks, perception checks, stealth checks, and investigation checks where the result would not be immediately evident to the player. They roll them blind to me, and then I can show them to the group at appropriate moments, and it just automates that process so nobody ever makes a mistake and accidentally rolls the dice and feels like they wasted this big old dice roll out there, and so on and so forth. As a patron of the Banios Battle Maps patronage Patreon page, I have a number of modules that are necessary in order to bring those tools into play. Some of the absolute most stunning 3-dimensional animated maps that are on the internet are put out by Benios. And if you're running Curse of Strahd, it's almost a must to go through the experience with the amazing maps that he's produced. And if you're running anything else, it's still pretty stinking awesome. In order to run that, you do need a number of different modules. modules that Benios lists in order to give you the rundown on those. But I run a lot of those, and those introduced me to Moulinet, which is a cloud-based service for doing a search through a bunch of different creators that you might have patron status with, and to be able to drag and drop their pre-walled, pre-lit adventure sites, their maps, their scenes into play. Moulinet is an absolutely stunning service that I've been really, really happy with, that has helped my game a lot to be able to manage stuff. Thanks, Div, for the compliment on the shirt there, man. I appreciate you. Thinking Foundry modules off the top of my head without having a list open. Those are the ones that pop straight in as being like real big game changers for me. I do run a fair number of little modules that help. There's a easy drag ruler is really useful so that people can see how far they've gone, keep track of their movement midway through movements. All of the monks modules are really, really useful for tiny little details and things like that. I'm also a patron of JB2A and the animated animations and D&D animations. Modules are really, really useful for creating awesome visual effects. The ones that made you laugh when you heard about the OGL rewrite about virtual tabletops being video games if they create animations, and so you're not allowed to do it. Yeah, JB2A already had me covered on those, so I was a little nervous for a minute before that all went away. Those would be the ones that pop off the top of my head, Brady. Definitely get in touch with me direct if you want a full list, and I'll just list off all of the ones I have and why, and be happy to hand that your way. Let's see. Nakaris, welcome. Said, have you ever finished a session with a headache from just the amount of information the players can learn, where you choose what to give and when? So I'm not terribly prone to headaches, so fortunately, because I would be in a lot of trouble on that front. So I'm grateful, knock on wood, to not be dealing with that on a super regular basis. But I would say that there is definitely a load of times that I have felt a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of information that I had, that I knew where to find the correct information, but found it challenging to seamlessly flow that into the world without having to stop and read, stop and read, stop and read. Sly Flourish's method of having a short list of clues in a specific section is one way to actually shortcut around that problem, and has been very, very helpful for me. When I'm in my prep stage and I'm reading an adventure or reading a section of a module, I'll then create a short list for that location of secrets and clues, information that's relevant to the situation, but doesn't have a clear means of being put into the hands of the party. And then I don't need to remember everything or be able to find everything in my list if instead I have this short list of 10 items that I can pluck into play. And so it eases that back on me a little bit and helps me not to get quite so stressed about it. Also, I use a very wide monitor and deliver most of my games online, and always have several tabs open for D&D Beyond. And on there, though the search function itself is awful on D&D Beyond, I think we can all agree, the Control F find option when you're in any particular chapter helps me to pull information quickly to my fingertips so that I can dive back and forth as long as I'm familiar with the material that I've partaken of. As long as you are familiar with your material, it doesn't actually matter if you don't get everything right. And that's something that we fall into a lot as DMs. We're perfectionists, and we want the world to be perfect, and we want the lore to be perfect, and we want everybody to learn everything, and we want it to be awesome all the time. And it's not as easy as we would like it to be. But if you are familiar as much as you're capable of, and then you're willing to let go of what you know is out there somewhere, but you're not sure where it is, you can flow a good game into the into the world and let people play with what you remember and how you remember it, and maybe shoot a few notes down to yourself about the things that you have just put in, so that if things change, it's okay if they change. Almost never are you going to actually throw something out there that you, from your familiarity but uncertainty, very rarely you're going to put something into the game that's actually going to ruin the experience of your players. Frankly, there's going to be times that you're going to make a mistake and put something out there in the world. And if you just pretended that you never did that, 95% of players are not going to call you on it or catch it, which is a little bit funny. But literally, unless somebody is writing down that exact note, it almost never comes up. So don't stress too much about it, especially if you're giving yourself headaches. Take care of your health so that you can run awesome games every week for your players, because it's way more important that they get to be there and get to have fun than that your game is so perfect that you have every piece of knowledge taken care of. Just try and relax a little bit if it's possible. Take care of your health. That's way more important. And maybe try using a quick list of pertinent lore and keeping that handy instead of trying to have the entire book in your brain at every moment. That would be my suggestion. I hope that helps. And I hope you look after yourself on the health wise. Have you checked out Flea Mortal's encounter building rules? Rolando, I apologize, but the answer to that is no. I have not taken a close look at those. I'm not against the option to take a look at those, and I hope in the future to do so. But for now, I just don't have anything that I would be able to usefully say on that. I assume that they follow some of the action-oriented encounter design ideals from Matt Colville's creations. I actually have a video coming out shortly about what I see wrong with action-oriented monsters. So maybe that will address part of that. But I'll add Flea Mortal's encounter building to my list of things that I should learn about, and I'll have to get back to you on that after I've done so. Sorry. Let's see. What is your favorite Unearthed Arcana subclass? Thanks, Ash, for the question there. Ash and Gaming. Honestly, that is a tough question. I have not tried to play any of the Unearthed Arcana stuff because I'm usually pretty happy with the stuff that's in the rules as they are. I have had a couple of players break into a few of them, and I can certainly, off the top of my head, name a handful of them that I don't care for, that I feel like are a little bit too powerful. But ones that I just enjoy are usually because I enjoy the story and the flavor behind them rather than the specific mechanics. I can engage with almost any set of mechanics and have a pretty good time. Oh man. I cannot from the top of my head remember a subclass that I was super excited about. I'm sorry there, Ozzy. I just cannot think of one that I was really excited about. I apologize. All right, let's see. I'm going to move on to the next one, and maybe I'll come back if I can think of something there. That's just crazy. From Darkness 321, welcome, by the way. I saw you said hi, and I apologize. I was too busy talking. What do you think of taking a system like D&D and making it into a sci-fi or cosmic horror game? I love it. I personally don't have any problems with people running any kind of D&D for any kind of story, any way. It's not like there aren't better options out there than D&D for certain kinds of stories, though. So if you are going to go that route, you may want to identify whether or not there's a specific reason why you really desperately want to stick with the 5th edition rules of Dungeons and Dragons in order to play something that might be better off in either a third party 5e crossover or in a completely different game altogether that just runs that kind of game. If it's because of system familiarity, then personally, I think that's a reasonably manageable reason to want to do that. It isn't impossible to do. D&D really can do anything because at its base, the rules in the background are just mechanics, and the lore is what determines what style of game you're running. But if you are running a sci-fi game, you're going to encounter a lot of times where small changes that make tons of sense, like putting laser rifles into your campaign, are going to drastically change the kind of dynamic that combat is going to have. And generally, it's just not worth it for most people to go to the lengths that are needed to rebalance everything if you're looking for an actually balanced creation. But if you're just looking for a fun night of D&D and you want to do something off the wall for a one shot or a short campaign, and you don't want to have to teach everybody a whole new set of rules, then have at it. Let it be broken and crazy and fun, and break it for your monsters and the like as well, and just have a good time. There's no reason why you have to be locked down into any one given thing. And while we have a lot of edition wars out there where people are like, you should just play this edition, or you just should play this game instead, none of that really matters. What's important is that you're having a good time. And so if being familiar with the system is a good enough reason for you to stretch to a different setting without stretching the rules as far as you would by learning an entire new game, then have at it. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable option. Ryan again with a question here. Thank you, Ryan. Let's see. Mainly for flavor. Oh, I think this was a comment rather than a question necessarily. Reflavor polling part silently to target 2 creatures. Was there, if you had a question in that one there, Ryan, then please go ahead and throw that in the chat, because as a moment I see it and it sounds fun. And if you, but it's, I'm not certain what question you have regarding that one. Let's see. Rolando again. Do you run games in an established setting or use a homebrew world of your own? Great question. I typically run campaigns in the Forgotten Realms setting. That's pretty much my standard, simply because I'm a total R.A. Salvatore nerd fan and loved the world and have done for a really, really long time. And so I have a fair amount of base knowledge. And on top of that, the wikis that are out there are so in-depth and detailed and useful for world building purposes that I find having all of that extra information and opportunity available without having to spend all of the hours building it myself is very, very helpful. And yet there's still tons of open room for me to build stuff into my own setting. One thing I try to do for my tables is take events from previous campaigns and have them have impact in the Forgotten Realms, to where it's my Forgotten Realms or my players' Forgotten Realms, and not just Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms or Salvatore's Forgotten Realms or Watsy's Forgotten Realms. So in that manner, I think that using an established campaign setting is in ways a homebrew endeavor over time. But I didn't start from scratch, and that's always been okay for me personally to not do so, just because I don't have that particular creative itch to that I want to scratch by spending all of my time designing deities and nations and terrain, world building in that particular fashion. I'd rather hyper focus in on world building a village or a cult or a storyline inside of the established setting. That's just me personally. Ryan. Okay. You're wondering if I would allow something like your earlier story into my games. Okay. So Ryan suggested or commented that for a flavor, one of his players wants to use the Reaper ability from a Death Cleric when attacking with sickles, or a reflavored polearm like a pike as a scythe, and use the ability to target 2 creatures. So there are some dangers in allowing abilities like that to transfer, but I do like to try and find a way to, with an appropriate amount of balance, allow things that players want like that. In the case of the Reaper ability, it's primarily intended, or I mean, not primarily, it's intended to allow spells that are of a specific school that target and deal damage to be able to target two creatures as long as they're side by side instead of just targeting one. When you open that up to be available for weapon attacks, what you're essentially doing is allowing a strength plus proficiency modifier attack roll against armor class instead of whatever mechanic is being used by the spell in question. And so the thing that you need to judge is, one, are you making this an extra option to where they have both, which just opens the field of options available to them, or are you making it one or the other? If you're making it one or the other, then you just judge whether or not it's more powerful, which the answer is it's probably not after fifth level. And until then, it should be on par to slightly more potent to be able to make melee attacks versus doing spell attacks, but it targets a whole different thing. If your player is really excited about changing an ability, it serves to try and find a way to find out what they're looking for and to do it with flavor as much as possible rather than doing it with the mechanics. You could easily, for instance, keep that exact same ability with absolutely no change and instead have the description of, say, Told Dead be them summoning up a pair of spectral sickles that they fling at distance at their opponents, or if their opponent is up close, they instead summon a scythe made of black shadows that they sweep through the two creatures ahead of them. In both cases, these weapons unerringly hit and a wisdom save ensues. Literally, you have changed nothing on how the ability works at all. All you've done is change the flavor, and in changing the flavor, your player has exactly what they're asking for without you having to take any kind of chance of breaking a mechanic and breaking the rules in a way that is going to have unintended consequences. So I like to change by description as much as possible and by mechanics as little as possible, because typically mechanical changes are unnecessary if you can find a way to describe them in a way that meets the requirements of the player. All right. Question from Joe Oak. Hey, Joe Oak, welcome, by the way. Have you played any of Free League's games? Dragonbane, Vasen's, Tales from the Loop. Unfortunately, this is another of those ones where I have to unfortunately say no. I have not. In fact, I actually don't believe that I've heard of Free League, Dragonbane, Vaesen, or Tales from the Loop. Tales from the Loop sounds vaguely familiar, but I have not played or heard anything about those games, so I'm not qualified to give a reasonable answer on those. I apologize. All right, from Rolando. I'm glad you did the Crystal Shard. That was a great one. Fantasy book series that would recommend outside of Dungeons and Dragons and the Forgotten Realms. All right, I have an entire hallway full of books just around the corner from here, but I'm not going to wander off screen in order to come back and answer this one. I love the fantasy genre, and I love to read, and there is probably always, in my opinion, value in reading anything that you can get your hands on when it comes to building your own repertoire of ideas and your ability to describe things, and loads of value in reading when it comes to being a good dungeon master. I would say that some of the adventures and books that I have really enjoyed recently, I'm a big fan of Brandon Mull and the Fablehaven and Dragon Watch series. I get a lot of inspiration from Dragon Watch in particular, with different envisionings of dragon kind instead of the tried and true Dungeons and Dragons ones. I've really enjoyed. I read a lot of young fantasy, like young adult or youth fantasy fiction, because I'm not a really big fan of bad language or sexual scenes in stuff that I'm reading. So I tend towards the younger crowd and just enjoy the descriptive writing and the like. Some of my favorite authors are David Eddings, R.A. Salvatore, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, Brandon Mull, Rick Riordan, um, Brandon Sanderson, pretty much anything any of those people has ever written has been a fun addition to my ideas base and helps me to come up with fun ideas on the fly and more descriptive language and fun stories. But the biggest part to using those kinds of books to get better at D&D is to take time after you've read to think about what you read and why things were used that way and how you could use them to better your Dungeons and Dragons game. So taking a minute to ask yourself a couple of questions, maybe filling out one of the DM improvement templates only for reading instead of for your own session can be a great way to get better understanding and control of pacing and descriptive language and storytelling. So that's just a side answer to that. Spencer suggested the Iron Druid Chronicles as a great one there. Thanks so much, Orlando, for your questions, and have a great one. We've got about 10 minutes left. We've managed to make it all the way to the bottom of the list here. If anybody else has any more questions, please go ahead and drop them into the chat, and we'll see if we can't cram them into these last 10 minutes. I really want to say thank you to everybody who makes these kinds of things possible, in particular to our tank class supporters who choose what I muse about every week and have really helped to provide direction as to the different topics that they feel are important. So at least I know when those videos come out that one person or two people or three people are looking forward to that specific piece of information. If you have any topics that you would like delved into deeper, then please go ahead and drop those in the comments after this, or comments on any of my videos, or direct message. I don't care how you get it to me, but just let me know what you would like me to talk about or what problems or questions you have, and I would love to go into depth on your behalf about them. I love talking about D&D, and so this has been a real fun adventure. It's the 29th of March today, and we're 2 days away from the end of March, which is right about the 1-year mark of the channel, and we are closing in on 5,000 subscribers at the moment, and that's way more amazing than I ever thought was possible when we started this journey early last year. So thank you for being here and for all your support. All right, it looks like we are dry on questions for the moment, so I will bid you all a wonderful day. Thank you again for being here, and as always, thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.